I'm Sean, I'm God Squad's International President, and you join us for the next instalment of our road trip through the Gospel of Mark, where we're looking at the ministry of Jesus on the road with his mates. And we're going to be looking this week at a few verses from chapter 1, verses 29 to 34 shortly. Now, last time, Buckshot from New Zealand shared with the previous section with us on how Jesus had invited a few working class fishermen to follow him on what would pan out to be a very alternative journey. And we left it last time with Jesus having exorcised a demonic influence from a man in a synagogue, and Buckshot highlighted how this powerful, oppressive influence was also representative of the oppressive influence of the authorities at the time. Jesus' road trip of freedom, of liberation, had now effectively gone public. Word was starting to spread. So let's take a look at the first of the two sets of verses we'll read this week, and it's chapter 1 verses 29 to 31. And Jesus goes round Simon Peter's house. It says this: as soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and he helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. Now, it's important to realise this was the Sabbath, and quite naturally, after the communal gathering in the synagogue, Jesus and these four working class fishermen planned to share a meal together in the family home with others. And typically of Mark, in his writing, he doesn't actually give us a great deal of detail. It's fast paced. He only gives us what matters. He tells us it was the home of Simon Peter. This was the same Simon Peter whose memoirs and reflections it's thought Mark used as the basis of this particular gospel account we're looking at. And at the start of these reflections, as he'd been talking to Mark of his calling by Jesus, Simon Peter told him of an intimate and early experience of when Jesus came round for some grub in the early days of ministry, maybe innocent days perhaps, before it all got real complicated. And it's an intimate setting, and it reminds me of a time several years ago when a friend in a club invited me into the home of his ageing parents, the home he'd grown up in, and he asked me to pray for his ageing and sick father. The sharing of hospitality in a home will prove to be a consistent theme in Mark's Gospel. It's in people's homes Jesus shares food with outcasts, talks with crowds of people, heals people, and also brings private counsel and significant teaching. Simon Peter's mother-in-law, he tells us, was sick. And here we imagine Simon Peter had a family, he had responsibilities, a home to keep. Even in these early days of being on the road with Jesus, leaving his graft, his hard work as a fisherman, didn't mean that life was going to be any more straightforward than it already was. If you were at the bottom rung of the social ladder then, you were poor, your household therefore was more likely to be sick. And maybe having seen what happened in the synagogue with the exorcism, maybe they hoped Jesus might help in this situation. And sure enough, Jesus responded with compassion and gently saw the woman regain her strength and returned to continuing sharing hospitality with an honoured guest. The exorcism of a short time before in the synagogue was as a result of a word from Jesus. This woman's healing, though, was as a result of a touch from Jesus. But on both occasions, Jesus responded to an urgent situation with authority. But as we'll discover through Mark's Gospel, there's a lot more going on than simply fixing an obvious problem that was in front of him. Now, these two miracles had taken place on the Sabbath, the Jewish sacred day set aside for rest and the worship of God. Keep this thought for future readings, because Mark is introducing a theme here that will cause no end of trouble as Jesus' road trip unfolds. It's something that Ched Myers describes as something like theatrical disobedience. Sabbath day observations officially close at sundown, and it was after sundown Mark records Peter's reflections of what happened next in verses 32 to 34. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all who were ill and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. So, once there was freedom from the Sabbath day restrictions and rest, the sick were literally carried to the door of the home where Jesus was relaxing. People were talking about Jesus. They were looking for him, and typically of Mark, he uses exaggerated language to emphasise the impact Jesus had made. All the sick, the whole town turned up, a constant stream of guests looking for healing, looking for hope. That's the picture we get here. As Jesus began his public ministry, he probably wasn't the only magic show or freak show in town, but there was a difference here. Whilst it was commonplace for there to be people around with some reputation for being healers and miracle workers, no one else would cause as much upset among the authorities, quite like Jesus would eventually do. If you were on the lower steps of the social ladder in the region of Galilee, you were more likely to become sick. Unfortunately, this is a trend that continues today in many of our communities. The crowds that gathered at the door of Jesus, who'd continue to flock to him, were the dispossessed, the kind of people for whom disease and disability were part of this vicious cycle of poverty and oppression. If you were sick, you had no pay, you had no work. If you were sick, you were also considered ungodly, impure, unclean, and therefore excluded from much of community life. From the start of Mark's account of the new way that Jesus was proclaiming, his mission is closely connected with the conflicts of a divided and broken community. He constantly becomes sought after, especially by the people who were looking for hope from their oppression. He was accessible to the masses, but he'd also become constantly hounded by those in power. People came to Jesus. He healed the sick and he exorcised the demons at this home. In doing this, he not only relieved their afflictions, he enabled people to become more whole, if you like. They'd have one less reason to be excluded. But why the secrecy? Why silence the demons and the people into saying who he was? And, what was all that about? Now, these were powerful acts that defied logic and the laws of nature, without a doubt. But the more powerful statement is how they challenged the social order of defining who was in and who was out, of who was acceptable and who was an outcast. Rowan Williams comments that Jesus might have been suggesting something like saying, I know I do miracles, but in the big scheme of things, that isn't what is important. That isn't what matters. The secret is not trying to work out how do miracles happen or who does them. The secret is the event, if you like, that changes everything. That's the kingdom of God at work in our lives and in our communities through a life reorientated towards and through Jesus. It's not about power, it's about relationship, which Mark's gospel is full of, especially relationship with the marginalised, the outcast, the dirty, the poor and the sick. And as I think about the crowds that turned up at the door to see Jesus, I can't help thinking about the marginalised and ostracised in our own communities now. I have to ask questions like, are our church communities still representative of a Jesus whose name we bear? Are they still a place where the crowds of the poor, the dispossessed, the marginalised and broken naturally gravitate to without fear of being rejected, abused or patronised? Do the friendships and relationships we encourage and embrace cause offence to those who abuse their positions of power? Or does the way we rebuff and reject people cause offence and hurt to those that are already beaten down? So how accessible is the Jesus of the modern day Western church to the poor and the oppressed? And I can't help thinking that if the idea of replicating a ministry like Jesus had of healing and exorcism, if that's separated from embracing the poor and marginalised, and it's not willing to risk its reputation and livelihood, then it's not a ministry that truly reflects the Jesus of Nazareth we see in the Gospels. In a world and among communities that continue to be deeply divided, where people that God has wonderfully created are marginalised for all sorts of reasons, what will the way of Christ demand of us today? So what crowds do we welcome at our door and into our lives? And what crowds do we quite simply wish would go away? And I don't think that, in all honesty, is a question that we can ignore if we claim to follow Jesus as we read these Gospels. So join us again next week for the next instalment of Mark's road trip with Jesus. And my prayer, our prayer, is that it becomes a transformational journey for each of us whatever our starting point happens to be. And if you've just stumbled across this series, can we suggest you take a look at the previous 4 and the introduction, because they all fit together in one big long story of Jesus on the road with his mates, with a transformational message that life can be radically different. Cheers, God bless you, see you next time.